Okay, today I'm delighted to be joined by Marga Hoek, three-time Chief Executive Officer, board member, investor, and member of Thinkers 50. She's the award-winning author of two best-selling books, Tech for Good and The $1 Trillion Shift. So thank you for joining us today, Marga.
Great pleasure, Gareth. Thank you.
So first questions I want to ask all my guests on the podcast is, how did you get started in sustainability?
Wow, that goes way back. Goes back to my first CEO role, which was CEO of a mid-sized construction company. And at that time, I realized two things. One was that company was very close to, all the family related and to the area where it was operating and building things. And I saw there were many people without employment. So there was the social side of things that I thought, why would I make life difficult for us to go a long way to find people to work for us? Whereas, there are people very nearby. They might have some shortcomings in whatever way because we had a social workers place nearby. But it made total sense to include those people in what we do. That was the social side. And I learned that it was very beneficial, but also very rewarding in sustainability way to do so. And the other thing was that I noted that we were in a heavy price competitive market. Mm-hmm. We had a lot of people, a lot of worries, and only a couple of percent margin. And I thought, how can we move out of that price competitive situation? And I thought that's by doing things that others don't. By looking at our role in a different way. We don't just create, buildings, but what actually kind of value can we create? And then I found out that all our clients, whether they were business clients or governments, whatever, that they actually lack knowledge how to make buildings more sustainable, and that it would appreciate that knowledge, but also appreciate those products. Yeah. So we started to develop more sustainable buildings that were carbon neutral already a long time ago, but that were also more livable, more comfortable. And yeah, then it proved to me that, and that has become my tagline throughout and still is, that business for good is good business. And once I started on that journey, I thought, well, this is the way business needs to be in the future. And so it became my personal mission, if you will.
Yeah. So how did that evolve to, as you say, becoming your personal mission? I can see it from within, running one business. Did it go through different chief executive roles before you decided to shift what appears to be full time into the sustainability space?
Yeah. Yes, it did. I mean, don't forget, if you're CEO of one company, sustainability can be your full-on thing, huh?
Yeah.
And it should, because if you are a company and you want to drive a purpose, then it has to be at the core of your strategy. So even if you drive one company, it doesn't mean you have less impact at all.
Yeah.
Having said that, my next role was for a listed company, also in the construction sector, where I further enhanced my mission on delivering sustainability into living areas with buildings, but also total areas, in collaboration with other companies, with governments. So my impact, you could say, scaled up because, of course, this company was way larger being listed. And following that, I was actually asked by a minister of the government at that time to set up the Dutch Sustainable Business Association, Chile, for instance, because you have to change the model.
Yeah.
We had to look for innovations to solve certain things or problems. For instance, if you go into a circular model and you go into sharing instead of owning, how does that work out in terms of insurances, for instance?
Yes.
Because that wasn't possible at that time. So all those things. And after I've done that for many, many years, I have switched to a non-executive portfolio, if you will, to help companies to drive sustainability, but, also to be profitable, of course. And I started to author books and speak around the world. And that's what I do today.
Fantastic. If we could move on to one of your books, $1 Trillion Shift. Now, I gather the premise is that the UN's Sustainable Development Goals represent $1 trillion of business opportunity. Perhaps you could start by, in case anybody listening doesn't know what the Sustainable Development Goals are, perhaps you could introduce those to us.
Yes, of course. So the Sustainable Development Goals is a set of goals encompassing ecological, social, and governance aspect, which we all recognize as ESG. Probably everybody knows that. But ESG you could subdivide into 17 goals.
Mm-hmm.
And how did those 17 goals come about? That's because leading up to 2015, because before that we had the millennial goals, but they weren't very well known because it was much more an NGO thing, a government thing, and very much focused on the social side, on poverty mainly. But then businesses stepped in and wanted to help to make sure that by the time those ended and we started on new goals, it would be a set of goals that were smart because, businesses need smart goals. They need to measure things and set clear objectives. And so they worked together with the UN and all those NGOs and organizations to come up with a set of really concrete goals. And they ended up with 17. Actually, it's 16 goals, and the 17th represents partnerships for the goals. So it's a different kind of objective. And to give you a couple of examples, they evolve around education, beating inequality, climate change, biodiversity on land, biodiversity in water, climate change, obviously, well, all those goals, ESG, 17 in total. And if people tell me, oh, well, 17 is way too much, then I always say, but that's what the definition of sustainability is about.
Yeah.
It's not more simple than that because impacting one goal means impacting at least 6 or 7 others.
Yeah.
And not only within the group of E and S and G, but in between. To give you an example, climate change, creates poverty, creates hunger, and so they're intertwined. That doesn't mean that everybody has to aim for having impact on 17 goals. It's important to select those that are closest to your purpose, closest to your type of business, obviously. But it's what we have to achieve to get, in the end, a sustainable world for everybody around the planet.
That's my experience as most big corporations will pick somewhere between 5 to 7 SDGs and that are most material to them. But where does the $1 trillion figure come from?
It comes from the fact that when I started to write that book and throughout my journey, it was clear that there was a thought back then that sustainability will cost money. Mm-hmm. That it will raise your cost or reduce your chances of winning procurements or anything like that. And it scared people. It scared people that there has to be a lot to be done, but how can we do this? And people weren't aware of the fact that actually challenges and long-term profitability are positively synergized. In other words, where there's 17 challenges, these Sustainable Development Goals we just discussed are a means to an end. They're a way to measure it. They unlock new markets. Mm-hmm. Now, how does that work? If we need climate change to be prevented or to put a stop to it, then we need renewable solutions. We need renewable energy, we need new mobility solutions, we need houses that don't use energy or only renewable energy, and so on and so forth. We need to reimagine industry and so on and so forth. The majority of those solutions have to come from business. If you look at the largest economies by revenue in the world, the largest economies by revenue in the world, 69 of the 100 are companies and not countries.
Yeah.
The climate change is caused by the majority, almost half of the carbon footprint is caused by 32 companies.
Yeah.
So the problem is in the hands of the few, but the solution is also in the hands of the few. And many smaller companies can really, really help because they sit in some place in the supply chain. So we wanted to know, when I was part of the Global Business Commission, can we put a price to it? Can we make it concrete for people that if you have a positive impact on these Sustainable Development Goals, that ties into new markets opening up? And so we researched for a long time. It was a lot of work, and you can't never be sure that it's the precise number. But anyway, we came up with $12 trillion until 2030.
Right.
And that's a large number, and that evolves around cities, energy and materials, health and well-being, and food and agriculture. Those are the sweet spots of growth markets. And so, on purpose, I called this book The Trillion Dollar Shift to show people and to motivate people, listen, markets are going to decline and other markets are going to open up and grow.
Yeah.
You must be on the right side of the future markets and tap into those new growth markets.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the message and the core of the Trillion Dollar Shift book.
Yeah. So, but I'm finding investors, many of them have ESG policies, but a lot of them are still keeping, a lot of their investment in fossil fuel businesses. And there's been talk of a backlash against ESG investing. Do you believe that's real, and is it serious, that backlash?
Yeah, there is a backlash. I mean, not in all parts of the world, but most importantly in the US for obvious reasons. But that backlash actually has multiple causes. So one of the causes is that now the tide has turned, and now there is recently wrote a blog about it, a green crackdown.
Yeah.
Because we want facts rather than great stories. But over the last decade, there have been a lot of green heroes and green hero stories of the most wonderful things people were going to do. And most importantly, this was done by CEOs of large companies. Now, that wasn't all bad will why they did it. It's also because we didn't know the consequences of those pledges back then.
Yeah.
And for some, it was just great window dressing. So it's there's two categories, you could say. But by now, we know that a lot of those great pledges were great stories, but won't materialize, and definitely not enough, and definitely not in time. Mm-hmm. So the investment world feels fooled.
Yeah.
Great things were pledged. They don't happen. Great promises were made. They also don't happen. And then there's another reason, and that's regulation. And of course, Europe, there's a saying, the US invests and Europe regulates.
Yes.
The emphasis on the regulation is here so much, but it's so complex and it's so different around the world, which causes a lot of uncertainty, and it causes a lot of costs to rise because you have to comply with different systems. You have to have the software, you have to have the people, you have to have the knowledge, and it's not entirely effective, so to say. But it also means a cynicism throughout the investment world on this ESG. It's a regulator's thing. I mean, does it really create value? We don't see the profits. All those stories don't come true. And, uncertainty, unpredictability, and things not materializing, those things are disastrous for investors.
Yeah.
And those things together cause a great backlash on top of what happens in the US, obviously, where Trump pulls out of it altogether, and everybody has heard the horrible sentence of drill, drill, drill. I'm very disappointed that then Europe starts reacting with variations to that slogan instead of ignoring it.
Yes.
That's a different matter. But that has caused, of course, a ripple effect. Yeah. And it also has caused a ripple effect here in Europe, that regulations that were set up, like the CSDDD and the CSRD, are now being pulled back.
Yeah.
Because US pulls out, and this is a global playing field, or it should be a global playing field. And all those things together, it does create a backlash. But, the fact that it's a backlash doesn't make it facts.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing to note. The fact that Trump pulls out doesn't mean that climate change isn't happening.
Yeah.
It's an opinion. It's decision based on an opinion. It's not related to facts. And the same is around the backlash of investments, apart from those companies that have overpromised and not delivered. Of course, they're the backlash, to be fair, from an investor's point of view. is justified.
Yeah.
But furthermore, the backlash doesn't say anything about facts that those trillion-dollar markets are going to come about, that they're going to evolve. It doesn't mean that the world isn't switching to renewable energy, because there's many more reasons apart from this to do that.
Yeah. There was a story here in the UK yesterday that the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association were saying that $2.3 trillion of fossil fuel assets could be stranded, so rendered worthless by 2040. But that number of 2.3 trillion sort of contrasted with the 1 trillion business opportunities. And I know that I'm not comparing apples with apples directly here, but it just seemed that there still requires a huge investment shift to get close to that sort of sustainable development goal trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. We lack finances, we lack investment related to climate change to take that part. A lot. We need 3.5 trillion more a year.
Yeah.
And I like what you said just now, Gareth, apples with apples, but it's apples with bananas or whatever other kind of fruit that always is being compared, because we also have to bear in mind, everybody's always talking, for instance, about subsidies on renewable energy, but we subsidize fossil energies way more.
Oh, yes.
Around the world. It was records during COVID, of course, but, it hasn't gone down sufficiently. Mm-hmm. We have a tax system around the world that taxes labor rather than resources and pollution. So it's like playing a new game with old rules. And that's the elephant in the room that still nobody really addresses. I mean, the carbon price goes up a little bit, but not that much. And we're like caught in this syndrome of raising energy prices, and then we don't want to tax it anymore because then fossil energies become more expensive.
Yeah.
But, all the energy and focus you put into that means you're not putting it into boosting up renewable energy and seeing where the innovation gaps are in terms of batteries, so that we have renewable energy at any time and any moment, and innovations that could easily solve it. Mm-hmm. Think about, for instance, that was recently also in the news, that 1.2% of Sahara covered by solar panels is enough for the whole world.
Yes.
3 minutes of the sun, if we were to be able to catch 3 minutes of the sun, it means 2 years of the entire energy use around the planet.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's also a small problem. We have to just put our minds and our wallets to it to get it done. And I always say, you had a fossil energy mix. It's not that we switch to only solar and wind. It's going to be a renewable energy mix.
Yeah.
1.0 now, 2.0 soon, 3.0 after, because it's going to evolve, it's going to decentralize more, it's going to be much easier, it's going to be applicable anywhere. We're going to have to think about energy in a completely different way.
Yeah.
I mean, we now have laptops in prototypes. It's a stupid example maybe, but just to give you an example, that recharge themselves in 20 minutes. We don't want laptops with plugs and then looking for electricity points because the bloody laptop is empty.
Yeah.
Life is much more comfortable if they recharge themselves. And so it's not only the energy necessity, it's also that our life will be better, our quality of life as consumers. As people owning houses, for instance, we don't want the fossil energy price raises or stagnations. Take care of ourselves. So the independency from fossil energy, and this is enhanced by all the current geopolitics, of course, that also is going to be a huge driver for change.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going off track here, I'm afraid.
No, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. But you've sort of taken us on to your second book, because you were talking about innovations. Your second book, Tech for Good. which surprised me because I thought it was, when I saw the title, I thought it was going to be about solar panels and things, and it's not. It's about other AI and novel materials and things. But what inspired you to write this book?
So when I wrote the $1 trillion shift and I was working with, the content of that book, it got to me that there's two components that are super important.
Mm-hmm.
One is capital. We just talked a little bit about that. And the other is technology. The awareness about capital is there more or less, but the awareness around the role of technology wasn't there.
Mm.
And this was in the time, like 3 years ago when I started on this book, where we had a lot of bad tech. And we had a lot of news from the US of big tech and doing bad things, or people just taking care of themselves by
Yeah.
technology, and so on and so forth. But I found that if we want to achieve those sustainability goals, and again, those sustainability goals are a means to an end, it's just a tool, huh? It's not more than that.
Mm-hmm.
Still, only 16% today, and they go from 2015 to 2030. So, we're over halfway through, but not over halfway through results.
Yeah.
Only 16% is on track, imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So, and only 5% of corporates is on track.
Yeah.
So that's not good.
Mm.
But if we use technology, we can do things we couldn't do before. And that's because we now have this unimaginable toolkit of both physical and digital technologies that blend into integrated solutions for whatever you can come up with, for every single business sector, almost for every problem.
Yeah.
But the awareness about that was low. The trust in technology was and still is low. And so I thought, I want people to be inspired to think about what actually can we do with technology if we put a purpose to it.
Yeah.
And if we do that, we can literally make up for lost time by the use of technology and get back on track on achieving those sustainable development goals.
Yeah. But some of those technologies in the book, I mentioned AI and blockchain, those are notoriously energy intensive. So how do their benefits outweigh their costs from an environmental
Thank you for addressing that point, Garrett, because it's such a non-argument. It's a non-argument. It's not about, I just illustrated that we don't have a lack of energy in this world.
Mm-hmm.
Energy is not scarce. Energy is abundant, as long as we create it in a renewable way.
Mm-hmm.
Sustainable way. There's no lack of energy. We have to forget about that. If that's not the case, the only thing that's relevant is that high intensive energy using technologies or productions, industry, heavy energy using industry, for instance, as well, that they use sustainable renewable energy.
Mm-hmm.
But the same applies to electric cars. Electric cars by definition aren't sustainable. Because yes, they use electricity, so no carbon comes out of it. But how were those cars actually produced?
Yeah.
Were they produced with renewable energy? And there's a lot of rare materials and metals going into that car. Is it a circular supply chain? And that's the holistic view we need to use nowadays. We need to grow up and educate ourselves. It's not just one aspect we're going to talk about and take out and, put under a microscope. You have to look at the whole picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And of the technologies in the book, which do you think has the most scope for good, for want of a better term?
Well, let me mention a couple of those technologies. It's groups, huh? I think that's an important thing to realize. With those, in this fourth industrial revolution, it's technology groups. In the book, I wrote about 8 groups. And that is, Garrett, because I also want to simplify things. Because, even for me, and I know quite a bit about the topic, all those reports and books are so complex and they go into details. You don't get an overview. And I want readers to be able to get an overview and then use it.
Yeah.
So those 8 groups are AI and data, 3D printing, robotics, advanced materials, space technology, blockchain, autonomous vehicles on drones, and extended realities, better known as virtual reality.
Yeah.
Those are the 8 groups. Some of them are foundational, like AI and Internet of Things are foundational for the other technologies. In that sense, if you want to judge what is more important, you could say that is more important because you need it, as we do access to Internet.
Hmm.
And this is an important topic because we always talk about the digital divide. But what we don't want is that this fourth industrial revolution flows over our planet, creating additional digital divide because people in remote areas and poor areas in the world don't have access to internet, hence can't use the advantages of those technologies, and they actually need them the most.
Hmm.
So that is a super important thing to bear in mind. But the magic is in the combination of technologies. To give you an example, in agriculture, we need much more food in the world. That everybody understands. The world population is still growing, economies are evolving, so we need more healthy food. By the way, we waste and lose 1/3 of all the food produced. So
Yeah.
that's another angle to tackle. But if farmers need to boost their production, but they should be able to reduce the amount of water they use, for instance, and precision agriculture. And for instance, there's companies in South America that do this, but anywhere in the world we have companies doing that. That one is called AgroSmart, for instance. It creates a platform for farmers to use. It's a combination of these technologies I just sketched, and on that platform, using that platform, they can be much more smart about how to go about in the agriculture, and it leads to a reduction of water use of 30%, 30.
Yeah.
It leads to a boost of the production by 20%. So 20% more result, 30% less water. You can do the math. There's a business case for this farmer to use this platform. The platform is much cheaper than the outcome, that. So there's a return on investment, which is huge, and that company that provides the platform is in a growth market, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking, when I was preparing for this about, this concept of intuitification, that Cory Doctorow's description that things that start off good quite often turn bad, and social media in particular, which was meant to democratize how we contacted each other and communicated and, shared pictures of our kids and all that kind of thing. And a lot of it has descended. And I was on Twitter / X this morning, and it was full of these fake investment things with AI generated pictures of celebrities supposedly being on the BBC telling me how I should invest my money. And, it's all been exposed as a series of scams. But this is quite a philosophical question. How do you make sure that we keep these technologies working for good rather than being hijacked for the wrong reasons?
We can't.
Yeah.
Let's not tell each other fairy tales. You can't.
Yeah.
Humans, by definition, aren't just all good, unfortunately. So with every technology that will come into the world, you will see that it's being applied for nonsense reasons, for leisure reasons, or for very bad reasons. And what is important, to close the back door as much as possible. By that I mean that the regulators have to dramatically reinvent themselves, because what happens, and I participate in some in London, for instance, is that the mechanisms of the regulator are way too slow, so they're always behind things.
Yeah.
What you refer to, all these stupid AI films that can be really, really confusing and damaging, has to do with privacy, and protecting people, that you can't put them in an AI movie and fake them, for instance. But our regulators are so slow that by the time they find out this needs to be regulated, it's already a big thing.
Yeah.
So that's one important thing, to be quicker, to be much more on it, to get knowledge into the regulator's office so that you're not, you're not educating yourself on technology while having to regulate it at the same time, which per definition doesn't work.
Hmm.
So that's the back door of things. Another side, which I see happening, is when, for instance, entrepreneurs start great things, they start something based on tech for good, and then they either get investors on board, or they're being invested by corporate venture capital, so corporate money comes into it, and then it often flattens and disappears.
Yeah.
And that's because we have to wise up as business people. You don't only look for capital, you need to look for the right capital and capital with a purpose. Because if you don't, you stand the risk of losing the reason of being in the first place.
Yeah.
And you would think, oh, well, that's a very naive thing. Who makes that mistake? Huh? That's the first reaction you might have. But it happens a lot, and there's a lot of non-good private equity in the world. There's a lot of good private equity in the world, but also non-good. And then they pull it back to a spreadsheet, and with all these things, the lending, the market line is longer than the line of many private equity firms, and then they push out the innovation. They punish themselves by it, by the way.
Hmm.
But it happens, and I see it a lot when corporates buy these scale-up companies. The same often happens. And that's something to look out for. I mean, I work a lot with entrepreneurs to warn them, be critical. You're in a growth market. You can afford yourself to choose.
Yes.
Choose wisely.
Yes. The choice is yours.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've mentioned the circular economy a couple of times during our discussion. I'm a big proponent of the circular economy, but where do you feel the circular economy is at? Whether you want to take a Netherlands point of view or a European point of view or a global point of view, and what can we do to accelerate progress towards a circular economy, do you think?
Well, everybody's for a circular economy. How can you be against the circular economy? But then in itself isn't worth a lot, huh?
Yeah.
Because it's about action rather than words. Where we had to give you one example. Yeah, let me give you one concrete example, and not like macro numbers, because that doesn't actually make it concrete. If you look at plastics, we make regulations to stitch the thing that closes the bottle on the bottle itself, for instance. We worry about these things. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because we recycle less than 9% of those plastics around the world, but also in Europe. But globally, plastic use is going to grow over the next decade by around 40%, 40. So we don't only walk backwards, we run backwards.
Yeah.
And we have all these sexy circular economy examples, and that's all great, that we make things with algae and with the remains of coffee and stuff. But what matters is that the size of our solution matches the size of the challenge.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's again actually greenwashing and greenwashing.
Yes.
And that's what I find important about circular economy, and not to depress anybody, but we have to have supply chains closed of those things that actually really matter and scale it ASAP.
Yeah.
And that can be, but still taxes, for instance, is a problem, because still often, to make something new is cheaper.
Yes.
Than to make it in a recycled way. That has to change yesterday, I mean, again, it's a new game played with old rules. We don't do that in life. Why do we do it here?
Yeah.
So it has to change, and it has to have scale.
Yeah. I'm going to take that, just what you said there. I think that's a new game played with old rules. I think that's a perfect encapsulation of many of the barriers to a sustainable economy in total, is that both the rules and quite often the mindsets are still thinking back to a linear fossil fuel driven economy. So if we're trying to go to a renewable driven circular economy, the rules have to change. So
they have to, but we have This might seem as a weird thing to say, but in a way, the current instability and economic instability and geopolitics, which are huge risks around the world in multiple areas, are actually wins in the sales of sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, it seemed everybody's talking about these geopolitics, and of course, spurred by China, Russia, US. But it also boosted the concept of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And autonomy means, very simply said, that you can take care of yourself. I mentioned it earlier in our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's two areas where that's very crucial: energy and materials.
Mm-hmm.
Because the prices of materials, due to all of this, are changing rapidly, unexpectedly, and some things aren't even available.
Yeah.
So to move out of that, actually, sustainability is your escape route, because if you use renewable energy that you create yourself, you're independent of all of this. If you have a supply chain that upcycles waste into your raw materials, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
the technology to do so, because of that fourth industrial revolution, comes about more and more. If you do that, you can become independent. And now, of course, there's this great European movement stirred up from for instance, European Industrial Roundtable, so by the companies themselves, much more so than by politicians,
Mm-hmm.
is about having a closed loop on a European level.
Yeah.
But even better, having a closed loop on your company or country level.
Yes.
And many companies that had trouble scaling up, to give you an example, companies that upcycle waste into raw materials. So that's not only recycling, but upcycling, which is creating much more value. Like, for instance, Mint Innovation, which was a startup in New Zealand, is rapidly growing because being able to now upcycle metals, for instance, aluminium and all those things that we threw away until recently, now has another value because it mitigates risks. And so in that sense, and I would like to, really point this out, the instability in geopolitics is all the more reasons to accelerate sustainability and use tech for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I believe your latest venture is storytelling.
Yes.
Yes, with
Well, it's not a new thing. I think storytelling shouldn't be underestimated.
yeah.
Well, I speak around the world, and it's not because, I'm a stage animal and I love to see myself on stage or anything like that, but it's because we need to tell success stories. We need to show cases, and one of the most important components of my keynote speeches is to show cases from all over the world how things can be done. Because if people hear how things are done in reality, in this reality, here and now, then you empower them to become change makers themselves.
Yeah.
Good examples create followers. And so the storytelling around that is super important. That's why I do all the keynotes. That's why I write the books. And that is also why I was thrilled to join Imagine 5. And Imagine 5 is a global platform doing precisely that, giving stories to people how things can be done, as to inspire them to do the same in their own way, in their own specific way, but to show this is what people are doing, this is what can be done, and this is what we can achieve. To give hope, you could say, huh?
Absolutely.
Imagine 5 is an organization that does that in a very good and compelling way, also in a nice way, because I'm a firm believer of positive motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And they did it predominantly now for consumers, so for people in their private life, you could say.
Yeah.
How can you live a better life because of sustainability? How can you contribute, and so on and so forth? And they asked me to join as a global voice to their platform to do the same, but then from people's professional life.
Yeah.
How can you professionally impact to create a better world in many ways? And that's why I joined, and I think it's a great thing.
Yeah. So what's your go-to story? If you were going to do a keynote to business leaders tomorrow, and you didn't have much time to prepare, so you're going to go for one of your favorites. What story would you pick, and can you share it with us?
Yeah, of course. Well, in case anybody is listening to that, I always prepare. So it's not that I just, and there's many people who don't do that, and I find it super important. So I always prepare really well. What type of company, what part in the world, what could fly there, and what
Yeah.
could be there. The examples I like to tell people are examples about positive impact.
Mm-hmm.
I always talk about the back door and the front door. The back door is mitigating your negative impact. That you have to do actually on all those SDGs throughout ESG. But the front door is where you really create value and can create a positive impact on the world.
Yeah.
And those examples, I think, help people the most because then they can see, hey, a positive impact makes that I become part of the solution rather than the problem. And also reimagines the concept of economic growth. Because if you have a positive impact, the more your company grows, the better it is for the world.
Yeah.
Growth isn't a bad thing. I'd like to shift that paradigm.
Yeah.
Growth is good as long as the world is better off with your growth.
Yes.
And to give examples like that, I like examples where technology plays a role, these advanced technologies, and to mention a few, because there's many, and we have a research team that researches cases from all over the world non-stop because, things go fast, and I want to be able to show people what's just over the horizon, not what they can see already themselves. But for instance, if we make buildings, not only should they be energy positive, so we talk about examples like Ilitis, and there's a building in Norway that are already energy positive. But on top of that, it can even do more. So we can build buildings with a facing that is able to absorb the smog from the air. And for instance, there's a hospital in Mexico which has that facing. It's a German technology that absorbs smog up to 8,000 cars out of the air. That doesn't mean we can go on polluting, but it does mean that's what we can do already. Why shouldn't we should use that alongside roads, in tunnels, in cities. This is what technology can do, and this is what cases look like. I like cases that are related to education. We have virtual reality not just for fun, but imagine if schools connect with other places in the world and we use VR, we can literally show how it is to live in other areas in the world and create mutual understanding. We can literally teach people while being in another situation. We can use it to reduce fear with kids that are afraid for vaccinations. There's a company that specialized in that to raise the amount of kids that take vaccinations. For health and well-being, we have tiny robots and drones that can actually travel in your body.
Yeah.
We have tiny robots thinner than a human hair that can help fight cancer.
Mm-hmm.
We have companies that now, driven by the geopolitical changes and volatilities, use 3D printing as a way of upcycling materials and totally change their supply chains. I mean, I have hundreds of cases, but it's always cases like this that show we can have a positive impact, and that those examples can actually be scaled, because that's important. Remember earlier I said, the size of our challenges must be met by the scale of our solutions.
Yes. It's an interesting thing because, decades ago, sustainability was all about dropping in scale. I've got a copy of Small is Beautiful behind me here on the bookshelf somewhere. And, I'm with you. I think that, for these things to work on a global scale, obviously they have to scale.
Yeah, obviously.
Yes. Right. Well, we've been chatting for quite a long time. I was just wondering if you wanted to sum up for our listeners or viewers, what key messages you would like them to take away to drive this agenda forward.
I would say for everyone, everybody's impact matters. Let's start with that. Mm-hmm. I know that many people feel like it's just me, or they feel like it's just me. How can I make a difference? But if you do something, whether it's small or big, but imagine it's small, somebody else sees it and acts on it. Somebody
Yeah.
else sees it, etc., etc. So a ripple effect causes massive change, and it's personalities that change errors, not institutions nor corporates. So what you do individually, whether it is from your role as a consumer or whether it is in your professional life, it matters. I would urge people to rethink sustainability. So remember my very simple concept of the back and the front door.
Yeah.
Don't think about sustainability in terms of only less bad. Think about sustainability as being part of the solution and creating positive impact, because that's where the future lies.
Mm-hmm.
And those companies tap into the growth markets. So make sure not to forget that. And sometimes there's so much pressure on doing less bad by the regulators, by
Yeah.
the investors and others, that people tend to forget about it. Remember that the next decade will be about radical innovation. That doesn't mean incremental innovation. And by incremental, I mean, step by step, reducing your footprint is going to be less important, because if you do that at a massive scale, it definitely matters.
Yeah.
But to really have a winning business case in the future, it's about radical innovation.
Mm.
I think those things are most important, and approach it from a positive angle.
Oh, fantastic. I just think we've covered so much ground. And I think I suspect many of our listeners will have to listen throughout 3 or 4 times to pick out all the detail that was in there. It was so densely packed in. It was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Time to make the
Marga.
most of the time we had together, Gareth.
But thank you for joining us today, Margaret.
Yeah, can I just mention, if people want to, listen to things or read about things, I have a LinkedIn newsletter, Business for Good. I publish every month on current topics with cases, with examples. I would urge everybody to just sign up for that via LinkedIn. I share a lot on Instagram. I always share in my stories upcoming cases that give inspiration, because I think that's what we all need. We need to be able to imagine what can be done rather than being stuck in what not can be done.
Yes. Well, that's one of the reasons why I interview people like you, to inspire us to new things. But thank you very much, Margaret.
With
Thanks.
pleasure.
For